Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So for the beat myself to the punch. The webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available afterwards, in case you were wondering about that. And secondly, all attendees are muted, and we are using the Q&A tool up at the top of your screen, not the chat function, for any questions or comments you may have. So please use the Q&A. I'll put a couple of prompts in there anyway. We'll be keeping track of any of those questions as we move along, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar if you don't mind. And finally, contact information for each of our speakers will be available at the end of the presentation in case there are questions or anything else that you'd like to share outside the scope of this webinar. Now getting to the speaker bios. First, Linda Cook is a senior technical leader and environmental chemist and data scientist here at Weston&Sampson. She's got more than 35 years of experience specializing in the analysis, assessment, and interpretation of environmental chemistry data. For the past several years, most of her project work has supported clients to help them overcome the challenges associated with generating reliable PFAS chemistry data and to help them interpret the data in support of project objectives and source identification. Next, Jill Reddy is a project manager and environmental biogeochemist with Weston&Sampson. She has 10 years of experience in collecting and analyzing environmental geochemical data and previously worked as a hydrogeologist with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. She is also a licensed professional geologist in New Hampshire, and in her work, Jill supports clients with evaluations of PFAS fate, transport, and occurrence. And last but certainly not least, Todd Grigio is a team leader at Weston&Sampson. He's got over 20 years of experience assisting public and private clients in the assessment and remediation of contaminated sites. This includes measures to characterize and address multimedia PFAS impacts at mixed-use sites throughout New Hampshire. He's a registered professional engineer in both New Hampshire and Maine and is a licensed site professional in Massachusetts. And with that, let's get to it. Linda.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. If I can. So thanks for joining us today. As you know, we'll be discussing PFAS and topics relevant to the state of New Hampshire, including regulations, test methods, and some state data, as well as a couple of case studies. We'll be touching on topics at a high level today. If you'd like more detailed information about any topic, we would be happy to follow up with you and provide more information. Like so many great scientific discoveries, PTFE, which we commonly know as Teflon, was discovered by accident while Dr. Plunkett was working with refrigerants. And this material he discovered was inert to almost all chemicals. It was very slick and slippery. There were really no other compounds or materials that had these same unique attributes. And at the time, these compounds were considered to be miraculous. And because of those unique properties, they've been used for decades in a wide variety of application. We all know about firefighting foams, but it's commonly used in textiles, food packaging, cosmetics, building materials, medical devices, electronics, and really that's just to name a few. For many of these uses, like healthcare and electronics, there's been no currently available replacements for PFAS. So in these cases, PFAS are considered to be an essential use. What we're seeing now are regulations are now starting to target non-essential uses for PFAS. So for things like consumer products, household cleaners, food packaging, and firefighting foam. So where do we find PFAS in our daily lives? They're like virtually everywhere. You know, you think of your waterproof rain jacket and, you know, leather treatments to make, you know, your boots waterproof, carpeting. But, you know, manufacturers are trying to phase out PFAS in these types of products. But now all of that promise of PFAS, it's really transitioned to concern. There's multiple news articles published every day telling a much different story. Maine recently posted a do not eat advisory for wild turkey and deer. And, you know, PFAS manufacturers have been settling lawsuits in the multi-billion-dollar payouts. And I think I read an article the other day that New Hampshire just recently received their first of, I think, many payouts, this first payout for $8 million from 3M. So what are PFAS? You know, oddly, there's no consensus definition of what a PFAS is. The regulatory definitions are inconsistent and they're constantly changing and expanding. Fluoropolymers, EPA only recently designated fluoropolymers as a PFAS in September of last year. Maine and California currently have the most inclusive definition for what a PFAS is, and that specifies that just a single fluorinated, fully fluorinated carbon would be classified, a chemical with one single fluorinated carbon is classified as a PFAS. But under this really strict definition, some of our commonly used pharmaceuticals are now classified as PFAS, like Prozac and Lipitor are two popular ones. You know, these medications have been used for years and have been proven to be safe and effective, but now consumers are concerned. Now that it gets a PFAS label, that in itself is raising concern, even though we know that these drugs do not pose a risk. The one common element of PFAS compounds is organic fluorine, which is a fluorine atom bonded to a carbon atom. It's one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry, which makes PFAS to a forever chemical. But not all PFAS are created equal. You know, they have different attributes and functions and properties and very different toxicities. And this image provides a high-level summary of a lot of these, you know, common PFAS groupings. Today, we'll be discussing non-polymeric PFAS, which would be the center column here, and that includes the commonly known fluorosurfactants such as PFOS and PFOA. So why all the concern, and why has it risen so dramatically in recent years? First, PFAS are dispersed across the globe and we're finding it virtually everywhere. They bioaccumulate in humans and animals. And if you were to have your blood tested for PFAS, it's likely that it would be detected. And really, we've all been exposed. There are some direct health impacts that have reported higher PFAS toxicity associated with higher PFAS concentration. Some of those are listed here. Increased cholesterol levels, decreased vaccine response. But we see tox studies that indicate now that really low concentrations may pose adverse effects. But in this area, we really do need more research to fully understand the health effects associated with PFAS. We can absorb into our bodies PFAS from inhalation if there was, you know, dust that contained PFAS, via skin absorption, via the cosmetics or lotions we use, and via ingestion from drinking water or maybe food wrapped in, you know, microwave popcorn in the past was a prime example of PFAS in the packaging getting into the food itself. And of course, you know, if you touch something with PFAS on it and then you eat your turkey sandwich, that's another mode in which you can ingest PFAS. So EPA has finalized new drinking water regulations to aid with reducing this primary exposure to PFAS. And I'm going to pass the presentation to Jill, and she's going to discuss drinking water regulations as well as other federal and state regulations.
Great, thank you, Linda. So to start out, we'll talk about EPA's roadmap for PFAS response. And so in October 2021, EPA released their strategic roadmap for the agency's approach to addressing PFAS overall. The roadmap generally included 31 task items that fell into 3 primary categories. So that being restricting or kind of preventing PFAS from entering the environment in the first place, remediating existing PFAS contamination, and then researching PFAS analytical methods, health risks, and destruction technologies, any of those things. More recently, EPA has really been emphasizing the restrict category, so trying to prevent PFAS from entering waste streams in the environment altogether, and that's going to be a theme that you'll really see throughout the coming slides. Next slide. So then in April 2024, EPA finalized the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, which established enforceable maximum contaminant levels for drinking water and non-enforceable maximum contaminant level goals for 5 PFAS. The compliance date for those PFAS MCLs was set initially at 2029, but then in May of this year, 2025, EPA announced its intent to only retain the MCLs for PFOA and PFOS and rescind those other MCLs. This also noted a revised compliance date of 2031 instead of 2029. So EPA is noting that they intend to propose a revised rule sometime this fall and potentially finalize that rule in spring of 2026. So that will be something to watch. Next slide. As of May 2024, EPA designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, which is something that folks have been waiting for a while. This designation introduced release notification and disclosure requirements, as well as requirements for cleanups to address PFAS at Superfund sites. And just as a note, based on public records that are available for the state, 20 out of New Hampshire's 21 currently active Superfund sites have known PFAS impacts. So this is a pretty wide-reaching problem. Next slide. So kind of the last piece of federal information that I did want to touch on was that EPA released aquatic life ambient water quality criteria and benchmarks for PFAS in September 2024. These criteria aren't enforceable, but EPA's intent is for states and tribes to use these values in the development of their own water quality criteria, which we can touch on a little bit more getting into the state regulations. Next slide. So moving on to state regulations and responses, the state of New Hampshire has generally kind of been considered at the cutting edge of the nation's response to PFAS, especially over the last several years. There are several different initiatives that exist at both the division and bureau levels within DES, and there's a lot of links and general information available through their PFAS response website that will take you to those different divisions and bureaus for more specific information. There's also a ton of information available through the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services website related to exposures, health impacts, PFAS sources, and water testing resources. Next slide. Moving on to specific regulatory standards, under New Hampshire's contaminated sites rules, the state has enforceable ambient groundwater quality standards, or also known as the AGQS, for 4 PFAS, those being PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, and PFNA, and those have been in rule since 2019. The AGQS apply to all groundwater in the state of New Hampshire, and in general are kind of a strong driver for all of the environmental criteria in the state. And you'll notice that those numerical standards under the New Hampshire AGQS will become very familiar over the next couple of slides. Next slide. So DES estimates that nearly half of New Hampshire residents use private wells as their primary drinking water source. So not surprisingly, the drinking water MCLs that apply to public water supplies are equal to the AGQS that apply to all groundwater in the state. The New Hampshire MCLs are the current enforceable standards for drinking water in the state. So that's that middle column. However, we should be aware that these the federal MCLs, that 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, may be coming into play as we get closer to the enforcement date for the federal MCLs, which will likely be 2029 or 2031, depending on that coming federal rule. So then in February 2025, New Hampshire DES readopted surface water rules, which included incorporating those New Hampshire MCLs into rule so that surface waters that are either a source for a public water supply or within 20 miles upstream of a public water supply must meet the New Hampshire MCLs as a running annual average. A question that I know has been floating around a lot is whether the aquatic life benchmarks have been incorporated into the surface water standards. That hasn't been done yet, but may be coming in the coming years. DES hasn't announced an official date for those changes, though. And then probably the biggest piece of rulemaking that's been making waves lately is that in January 2025, DES established SRS for the 4 regulated PFAS with associated AGQS. Those SRS apply to all contaminated soil that results from a discharge specifically. And as a note, there are provisions in the contaminated sites rules for deriving site-specific SRS, but I think DES and others have really noted that it's very important that if you're planning to derive site-specific SRS, you should work with an environmental professional that has experience in doing so, since it's not exactly a straightforward process. A lot of additional information on the derivation criteria for the SRS and some information that's useful for deriving site-specific standards is available in the October 6, 2023 technical summary report that was issued by DES and is available through their website. For determining whether contaminants in soil are related to a discharge or perhaps a background condition, DES has been in the process of developing guidance for that process. That does include PFAS and is expected to come into play in particular with PFAS based on their widespread occurrence, as Linda was discussing. There's no firm release date for that guidance document yet, but DES has been assuring folks that it's coming soon. So hopefully we will be seeing that at some point in the near future. Based on a recent presentation that I was able to attend, the guidance is going to recommend completion of a desktop study and, if needed, a field study as kind of the 2 primary steps for that background determination. And it will also include lots of links to resources for conducting background determinations in general and common uses and operations that are associated with PFAS releases. So PFAS monitoring is required for wastewater treatment facilities that have groundwater discharge permits. This is a part of the permitting process. In general, detections exceeding AGQS at groundwater discharge permitted facilities may trigger response actions like receptor surveys, supply well sampling, groundwater treatment, and PFAS source identification in those elimination efforts that we mentioned previously. So that's important really for folks with a groundwater discharge permit to know what conditions and requirements for monitoring are in that permit. Since spring 2019, DES has been requiring sampling for PFAS as part of the sludge quality certification permitting process, and that applies to biosolids that are being distributed in the state of New Hampshire. While there's no specific standards for PFAS to meet in biosolids currently in rule, there are provisions in those rules that require groundwater at permitted sludge management facilities to meet the New Hampshire AGQS, which is the major driver there. So the current guidance coming out of the residuals management section related to addressing these is really emphasizing, again, source identification and reduction, which sounds good in practice, but you'll see where there can be some potential issues with that when Todd presents some case studies later in this presentation. And on the legislative front, again, really leaning into that source elimination kind of emphasis. In August 2024, former Governor Sununu signed House Bill 1649 into rule, and that restricts intentionally added PFAS in certain consumer products when the effective date for that is going to be 2027. So really going after kind of manufacturing processes to hopefully eliminate some PFAS from entering the waste stream. And then very briefly, we wanted to touch on some statewide data sets that are available for folks just to know what's out there and to support some site assessment and response that may come into play for you. So DES maintains the environmental monitoring database. That's for groundwater data collected anywhere in the state of New Hampshire. That includes loads of PFAS monitoring data at all different sorts of sites, from water supplies, from contaminated sites, et cetera. And that can be used as an initial screening tool when you're beginning site assessments or wondering where PFAS may have come from. And that will also be shown in some of the coming case studies. And then finally, in 2021, USGS and New Hampshire DES partnered to complete a background study to kind of support some of the SRS development and just other efforts at understanding PFAS nature and occurrence in the state. So this included sampling at 100 undeveloped sites that were selected randomly from a statewide grid. Samples at every single location were collected from 0 to 6 inches, and 50 of those locations were also sampled for soil at 6 to 12 inches, and then a limited number of locations were also sampled for soil deeper than 12 inches. As you can really see in the graph on this slide, PFOA and PFOS represent the highest concentrations of PFAS detected in both the 0 to 6 inch and 6 to 12 inch sampling intervals. So those are really the primary drivers of contamination in the state. Another important note that came out of this study was that PFOS was detected in every single sample, and PFOA and PFNA were detected in nearly every sample. The concentrations that were identified in this study and used to derive background threshold values that'll be included in that coming background guidance are well above the SRS for the state. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind as you get into potentially doing assessments on contaminated sites and knowing how to determine what might be background versus what could be a discharge. And with that, I'll hand it back to Linda.
Thanks, Jill. So I really could spend an entire hour or really a day getting into the details of PFAS testing, but we'll save that for another day. Today, I'll only be highlighting some of the details, some details related to PFAS testing. So as I had said, what we test for is really just a small subset of PFAS compounds that are currently available. So EPA methods, and depending on the method and the laboratory, the list of target PFAS that are analyzed for varies from 20 to about 100 different compounds, again, depending on the lab and method. But remember, we have tens of thousands of PFAS compounds, so we're really only capturing just a few with this targeted testing. Published methods for samples other than drinking water, or for matrices other than drinking water, were slow to be finalized. Method 1633 for all matrices other than drinking water was only finalized earlier this year, late last year. But in the meantime, laboratories created modified methods to test samples for matrices other than what was specified by methods 533 and 537. What I want to stress is that these methods are technically very difficult because of the instrumentation, the sample preparation method, and matrix complex methods and matrices, and the ubiquitous nature of PFAS in laboratories. The detection limits for these methods are generally in the part per trillion range for water samples, which is really teeny tiny, and in the parts per billion range for solid materials and consumer products. So we talk about detecting these target compounds. They're usually the ones that are regulated, like PFOA, but there's compounds that are referred to as PFAS precursors. And a precursor is a chemical, they are PFAS, but they're not included in the target PFAS testing methods. And these precursors can degrade in the environment to terminal products, which are then compounds that wouldn't degrade further, but which are regulated compounds. So this figure on the right is a great example of the complex network of many precursor compounds, which can all degrade to PFOA, which is the center node in this diagram. So for this figure, this is just PFOA. We could come up with similar schematics for all of the carboxylic acids in all of the varying chain lengths. So it really just cramps your brain a little bit to think about how many compounds are out there that may be in my water sample, my soil sample, that if we don't test for them, we wouldn't know they are there, but they could ultimately degrade to a regulated compound, which could cause a problem for us in the future. So how do we test for these precursors, and what are we really detecting? So researchers in the labs have developed a method referred to as total oxidizable precursor analysis. Each sample is treated with a strong oxidant to degrade the complex PFAS into simpler terminal compounds that we can then detect by the standard methods. So there's a lot of technical challenges with this method. I totally would be happy to discuss offline if you're interested. So in this figure on the right, I'm just highlighting in the blue and purple colors the PFAS classes that can be measured using this method. PFAS, this top analysis, is sometimes used as a proxy for total PFAS in samples. However, as you can see in this figure, it would really provide a low estimate of what your total PFAS load would be. What's interesting is there's regulations that are now specifying limits for specific PFAS and their potential precursors in consumer products, but we don't have a current method that has been finalized and approved for top analysis. EPA is working on one. I think ASTM might also be working on one, but here's an example of the regulations are now driving the science in order to get a method produced and finalized and tested that can support regulations that are already in place. So I talked about organic fluorine being that base of what a PFAS is. So here's another example of regulations driving the science in PFAS testing. Some consumer product regulations have set a limit of 100 ppm, and I quote, as measured as organic fluorine. But there's no final approved method for organic fluorine in products. So to fill the void, commercial laboratories have developed an extractable organic fluorine method. The sample preparation is similar to the PFAS test method, the targeted PFAS test method. But in this case, the extract is then analyzed by combustion ion chromatography to really measure all of the organic fluorine in the extract. And again, in this figure at the right, you can see that not all organic fluorine can be detected by this method. So again, EOF, or extractable organic fluorine, is just a proxy for total PFAS. But in most cases, it might be biased low, but if you're picking up things like pharmaceuticals and pesticides, you couldn't actually get a high bias in those results for extractable organic fluorine. Again, EPA and ASTM are working on developing standard methods for this test, but not yet available. So EPA did publish a final method earlier in the year for adsorbable organic fluorine in aqueous samples, another proxy for total PFAS. They noted with this method that it can be used for monitoring under the Clean Water Act. While it's a final method, it hasn't yet been promulgated. So again, based on the figure on the right, you can see that this method does not capture all organic fluorine in a sample, and again would produce a low estimate for total PFAS. And then my least favorite of the organic fluorine methods is one that we're seeing more often in consumer products, and we're actually seeing a lot of litigation cases using this type of method. So if we just use simple algebra, this method seems reasonable. If total fluorine is equal to the sum of the inorganic fluoride and organic fluorine, then you would think that a calculation as simple as total fluorine minus inorganic fluoride would give you your total organic fluorine, but it's really not that simple. The organic fluorine cannot be reliably or accurately measured in samples with a complex matrix. They use a water buffer solution to extract the inorganic fluoride from the material, and it's not really effective. Like, can you imagine, and this is a real case scenario, can you imagine putting wax into a watered buffer solution? You'd never be able to extract the fluorine from that wax matrix. And yet we had a case where that was exactly what was done. So in this scenario, if your inorganic fluorine measurement was biased low, which it often is in solid materials, when you then use it in this calculation, it would result in a high bias organic fluorine result. And really, depending on the matrix, that high organic fluorine result may be entirely due to inorganic fluorine, because that preparation and analysis for inorganic fluorine was just not appropriate or valid. What I really want to stress for everyone today is PFAS is not a routine analytical method. It's difficult, challenging. When I started in environmental testing, dioxins were the trendy method, another really difficult method, but dioxins were generally only performed by specialty analytical laboratories that had the experience and expertise to do that method. What I can tell you is this PFAS test method is even more difficult than dioxin analyses, but the growth market is so huge that every laboratory that can afford to buy an LC MSMS is jumping into the market, whether they have the experience and expertise to do it or not. So really staying with tried, true, tested laboratories is really critical to get the highest quality data you can. But even when you're using the best laboratory you can, this is still a hard method. It's really difficult. Ultra trace detection limits, a really specialized sample preparation. The ubiquitous nature of PFAS in the lab environment can cause contamination issues. Methods are changing, regulations are changing, there's matrix interferences. So again, just really know that this is a hard method, and any data generated using this method really needs the careful review from experienced chemists. And some of those data use challenges we're seeing are, false positives or bias high results, sometimes really significant and over regulatory limits. There's variability when if you're using different laboratories, even if you sent them both the same sample, you might get back very different results. There's a lack of consistency in laboratories that have modified the standard methods to do other things. Detection limits, you need to be really cautious about that. One lab's detection limits may be much higher than another's, and you need to make sure those detection limits are low enough to meet your regulatory limits. So we're making multi-million-dollar decisions based on PFAS testing data. And if these data aren't reliable, the foundation of your financial decisions is not solid. So getting good quality PFAS data takes really proactive planning effort, and it may increase those upfront program costs. But what I can tell you is those proactive data quality tasks and costs, you can plan them and schedule them and include them in your budget. Whereas costs associated with dealing with the impact of poor quality data, what I'm referring to on the slide here are those reactive costs. You can't plan them, schedule them, budget them. These costs may involve rework. It could cause significant schedule delays. You might not get the data that you actually need to make the decisions you need to make. If your data were like bias high or bias low, the designs that you're basing to deal with that PFAS contamination, you might over design or under design, again, a unintended cost. And then so many PFAS cases are going to litigation. You need data that can withstand the scrutiny of litigation. And so if you don't have that, if you end up with data that's of lesser quality, you may not have an effective litigation support and get the outcome you want. But with proper proactive QA planning and oversight, your team should be able to generate data that are suitable not only for your current project needs, but are able to support high-value decisions and can be repurposed to support future needs such as litigation. And with that, I'm going to turn the baton over to Todd.
Thanks, Linda. And hello, everybody. So as I was preparing for this presentation over the past couple of days, the one question I kept coming back to is, what does this all mean? So with so much technical information available about regulations and sampling methods and data quality, I think it can be really hard to understand what it actually means for you and your situation. Next slide. And in part, that's because the science and regulations keep evolving, like Linda and Jill just pointed out. But it's also because PFAS, unlike some of the other issues or contaminants that I'm used to dealing with, potentially impacts like so many different aspects of our projects or our day-to-day operations. And we can't really deal with these aspects individually, right? So one decision creates this sort of ripple effect that potentially impacts many, many others. Your choice about sampling could affect your regulatory compliance, which impacts your schedule, budget, and so on and so forth. And it's dealing with this ripple effect that the following projects that I'm going to talk about is meant to highlight. The next. So the first project, it involves a former manufacturing facility. It's located in southwest New Hampshire. It's located in a mostly residential area. The site was formerly used for a lot of different industrial purposes, including electroplating and the production of printed circuit boards. It's been the subject of a lot of environmental response actions over the past 2 decades. These have been to address environmental contamination, significant environmental contamination to soil and groundwater on site, as well as to address historical impacts to several nearby off-site drinking water wells, to the point where point-of-entry treatment systems were necessary to address chlorinated solvents at a couple of residential properties. As you can imagine, a small community would have concerns about a site like this. And at the very least, nobody wants to be living next to an abandoned, contaminated property. So a few years ago, the town started looking at options for this site and possibly taking the property so that it could be redeveloped and cleaned up further if necessary. But as part of that process, they wanted to understand more about the legacy of the former use and contamination and what that would mean for their risk, their liability, and how it could potentially influence property redevelopment in the future. Initially, PFAS wasn't really a contaminant of a concern for a site like this. It had never been sampled, despite numerous investigations and even some work performed by EPA to remediate soil. But as we talked more about it with the town, and we brought in representatives from DES, and we started to understand more about the site history, site operations, as well as what the town's goals were for this property and its reuse, it became clear that some PFAS testing should be part of their due diligence if the goal was to give the town a clear picture of what the contamination and what the potential risk for them for this project would be. So that's what we did. We performed a site investigation where, in addition to assessing the known contaminants of concern, we also sampled for PFAS, specifically in the groundwater. And our results, which you can see here on the slide, identified some fairly significant contamination in both the on-site shallow overburden as well as the bedrock groundwater. In most cases, the concentrations for a few of the target parameters were well above the applicable New Hampshire groundwater quality standards. The good news was that similar impacts were not encountered offsite as part of a private water sampling that was conducted for several of the nearby residents, which, given the historical impacts and previously detected in some of these wells from the releases that had occurred at the property, that was like a real concern as we were going into this process. So this was welcome news that there weren't significant doesn't appear to be significant offsite impacts. So what does all of this mean? I think in this case, the sampling data was essential, and it met its objective to help the town understand the current site conditions and start to sort of quantify what their potential risks would be for redeveloping this property. I think the town can be a lot more confident in their decisions going forwards, as well as in the plans that they put forward. Equally as important, I think the town is also, with this data, is also able to realistically evaluate what those future reuse options for the site entail. I mean, make no mistake, the concentrations that are detected in the groundwater at the site are very high, and these concentrations will limit some reuse scenarios for a site like this. Especially one that would require providing a clean drinking water source from like an on-site well. But other alternatives may not be as quite as effective. Something that is low occupancy, like passive recreation, it may not even be that affected from the sort of findings of our PFAS investigation at the site, and they may be able to be addressed through some sort of long-term monitoring. Again, trying to kind of paint that path or lay out that sort of framework moving forward so the town can make an informed decision. The next project that I'll quickly go through is this involves a paper mill. It's also located in southwestern New Hampshire. Like the previous project, this mill operated for many years, primarily making tissue paper and like specialty paper products for newspapers, etc. It was forced into bankruptcy, and as a result, was left with really no viable party or entity that could oversee the maintenance of the former facilities or the cleanup of the property. In this instance, the town opted to step in to sort of fill the void, which meant dealing with the former wastewater treatment plant and the closing of several lagoons. Working with DES, we assisted the town with closure planning for this lagoon site. This meant testing the sludge and the surface water to evaluate appropriate management requirements during the closure, as well as characterizing the groundwater, which had never been evaluated prior. So as part of our investigation, basically everything was tested for PFAS, and PFAS was detected in everything, usually at really high concentrations. So some people may be listening to this thinking like hearing that PFAS was detected in paper sludge is really not that surprising. And I would agree, it's definitely like a high risk use, and there's definitely some research or available information to suggest that you should expect to find PFAS in these types of source materials. But I think that misses like the larger point of why I wanted to talk about this project, because I think what it really demonstrates is why it's important to start thinking about these issues early in the process. And that's, I'm sorry, really early in the process. And that's because it's going to take some time to work through sort of the ripple effect of these findings. First and foremost, this project is going to require developing a cost-effective management approach for dealing with the materials during the lagoon closure. On-site discharge or untreated discharge of surface water with levels that are, several orders of magnitude higher than the, surface water quality standards or surface water benchmarks, or even the ambient groundwater quality standards, it's not really a viable approach. Similarly, removing sludge and spreading it or reusing it on site when the concentrations are also, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude higher than the soil remediation standards, that's also not going to be feasible. And there's a serious cost associated with managing materials with concentrations like these. And that's the immediate impact to the project. So getting back to what I sort of started by saying with this whole idea of this ripple effect, there's going to be more that needs to be done to understand the source, the nature, and the extent of the impacts at a site like this. And probably most importantly, who might potentially be affected by the findings or the contamination in this case. For this project, groundwater, like I said, was sampled. It was also impacted, not quite as high as the surface water sampling results, but there's definitely like a source of groundwater contamination for these target, PFAS parameters that you see here. Maybe they are confined to the property, and the source is one of the lagoons that wasn't lined with a synthetic liner. Or they may be due to some other sort of previously unassessed source, like a offsite sludge disposal area that to date has not been assessed for PFAS. So getting outside of the immediate sort of need and trying to figure out some of these other answers is going to be pretty critical. And I think that's the point that I wanted to sort of drive home, is that without answers to at least some of those questions, it's going to be really hard to fully understand the scope of the response. At a minimum, though, I think we know that the lion's share of the cost for a lot of these projects, or at least the projects that I'm involved with, will be in material handling and disposal. And that's where having the data is for a project like the paper mill project is most critical. In the past, I would say 2 to 3 years, we've definitely seen an increased emphasis on understanding potential PFAS impacts or PFAS source areas in the locations where soils are being excavated from downstream receiving facilities that are proposed to accept, those contaminated soils. There isn't like a benchmark level that applies necessarily to every single, receiving facility. And I would say their willingness to accept does vary based on where the materials are coming from and potentially on the concentration. As an example, I had worked on a project where a contractor was doing a small utility project to replace a small culvert in the Dover, New Hampshire area. And they weren't able to find any local disposal options for soil that, I wouldn't consider to be contaminated with any conventional contaminants like metals or SVOCs. It was primarily they couldn't find any options just due to the fact that the soil had been generated from within the larger site where the PFAS had been detected in the groundwater. There was no PFAS sampling for this site, partly because it was an emergency sort of situation that had to be addressed immediately, and it hadn't really had the time to do the planning and foresight to try to get ahead of this. But just the fact that the soil had been sort of generated from within a larger disposal site where there were evidence of PFAS in groundwater, that soil ended up going out of state essentially as hazardous waste, and there was a significant cost associated with that.
Hey, folks, just a heads up. Well, we've got 10 minutes left.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I'm about to wrap this up. I guess I don't think that there's any one approach that works for every project. I think my major takeaways from having done several projects that have involved PFAS and various media is that you need to acknowledge and account for this PFAS ripple effect. I think doing that takes considering the issues like those I discussed in these representative project case studies, but also the issues that Jill and Linda had hit upon. I think you need to discuss those early, and I think you need to sort of discuss those with all the stakeholders at all the various stages of in the life cycle of a project, from planning and permitting through design, construction, and operation. In cases where it makes sense or you're likely to sort of interface with high risk use, such as dealing with biosolids or dealing at a sort of formerly contaminated site, getting data will absolutely make the planning effort much more productive. You have to be thoughtful about how that data is collected and what methods you're using to make sure, like Linda said, the data is usable. However, I would say that until the science on PFAS is settled and until the regulations sort of account for that settled science, there's going to be no way to completely eliminate the uncertainty with dealing with this issue on any project. So I would say that, when planning or thinking about these issues, at every stage, you really need to be considering contingencies to account for this uncertainty that we're all going to have to live with for the foreseeable future, at least, and because it's going to be critical to stay ahead of it. And with that, I will turn it back to Chuck or Linda. I'm not sure. Sorry.
All right, Linda or Jill, do you have anything to wrap us up with?
No, I think
Yeah,
that
okay.
that was great. Just if
Okay.
anyone has any questions.
Okay, good. Well, seeing as how I don't believe there are any questions in the Q&A, we'll go ahead and sign off and let you folks get back on with your day. As mentioned earlier, the webinar was recorded, and we'll make the recording available to all the attendees. And one thing I've failed to mention before, we will also be sending attendees a continuing education unit or CEU form that you can submit as you see fit to your individual certifying agency. Note, though, that our CEUs are not certified by any particular organization and may not be applicable for all certification programs. And lastly, you can see the contact information here. Please feel free to reach out directly to any of our presenters with questions or comments that you'd like to share outside the scope of the webinar. And again, thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your week.